Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of An Intelligent Discussion. I'm your host, Ben. You're here with Justin and Will, and we have a special guest today. His name's Jarod. He came all the way from Arizona to be a part of our little group. Jarod, you want to tell us what we're talking about today?
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. This is now podcast etiquette. We have to, for our discussion at hand, we will talk about today. We're going to start off with Evergrand, one of the largest Chinese real estate holding companies, and their potential collapse. And then from there, we'll talk about a couple of things dealing with Zillow and their home buying process and how they went bankrupt recently. And then from there, it's kind of an open field. But that's where we're going to start off today.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so like the whole situation at hand with Evergrand in a way. So they're a Chinese-based real estate company, and currently they are in the process of potential bankruptcy. So what's being done right now is that they're possibly being forced to sell off a lot of their assets, depending on if the government intervenes or not. That's the big deal. That's the kind of the question is that they have around $300 billion worth of debt that needs to be repaid. Not all that needs to be repaid currently, but in the next coming year or so, I believe there's at least $3 billion which needs to be repaid back to investors. So that's where the potential Chinese government intervention will come from. What this means then, in a sense, is that the company's going to have to repay back the investors, and then the people that are being put into these properties, what will happen to them? So my entire idea is that the selling off of these assets that they will have to do, it will trigger a fall off of the Chinese real estate market, and everybody else involved, as far as investors and potential investors, will be given discounted prices on these potential investments, which will then trigger the collapse of the real estate market. How that will affect us globally, we have no idea. But from the standpoint of China and them being the largest company, it's not looking good in that way. So the negative effects in that way that the media has given China and also Evergrande also adds to these discounted prices, because from what I've seen from a couple of clips, there were protesters outside of Evergrande in the last couple of weeks demanding answers of their money back, because there's people that are waiting to be put up in these properties that just have not been given keys yet, because they have around 700 properties that have not been finished yet. And each property houses hundreds of people, so you can do the math on as far as how many people don't have homes yet. So the situation then we'll see out of the course in 2022, just as how bad it gets, as these billions of dollars that will have to be paid back to investors. How this will happen. Evergrande currently, their company, they've been suspended from the Beijing Stock Exchange, and then they've also been downgraded as a creditor from major banks, so they cannot gain any more capital from outside sources. So they're forced to sell internally, which only makes their situation worse because it only devalues them as a whole. So the question is,
Jarod, I don't want to interrupt you. I know you're about to posit a question. My thought immediately after hearing everything that you said is, to what scale does the Chinese real estate market and Evergrande being a part of this, like, as someone who has very little context as to what a house costs in China, and obviously it's going to depend if you're in Shanghai, Beijing, if you're in an industrious, metropolitan area as opposed to like rural, give me a Chinese valley.
Agobi.
Do you have any like frame of reference on that? Do you do any of it? Like, I don't know.
I can make a accurate guess as far as what a people's perspective of somebody living in China will be like. I'm from Arizona, so I have no fucking idea what's going to happen. So these people aren't going to be, they're not going to have homes. The company isn't building anything. They've spent a lot of their houses and properties. So you're going to leave hundreds of thousands to not millions of people. Not millions, I would say. I'll scale that back a little bit on that point. But you're going to leave a lot of people without a place to live, and also a lot of money because these people put down payments on these properties. So what's going to happen, like if a very large corporation of America, let's say like a real estate company in America does the same idea and they mislead buyers and they say, "Hey guys, we have properties for sale, and we're building them right now." Oh wait, we don't. What does that do to our economy and our real estate? Think about that, and then translate that overseas.
So why is Evergrand going under, and why aren't they finishing their construction projects?
Uh, it's a two-parter. They were overly hedged in a couple of areas because of how their business was set up. From like doing like a 1 day deep dive on like how they were gaining capital was that they weren't set up as a business that quarter over quarter they had sufficient money being reinvested. How they got their money was through new people buying new properties, and they took that money and they reinvested it. So yes, they were getting returns, but they were immediately spending it. So once that dried up, meaning that people that were putting down payments on homes, that was gone. COVID happened, their bankruptcy or potential bankruptcy happened. So that source of income is gone. So that's a part of why they're going under, is because they just have their main source of income is now flat in the water, and they are now forced to sell off a majority of their assets.
Justin, do you have any concerns about this ripple effect in the Chinese real estate market and how it may or may not translate overseas to our markets here in the U.S.?
So, what perfect timing. Uh, there's a lot to unpack with the assessment of the quote-unquote Evergrand crisis. My concerns lie solely within what happens. I don't want to say when, because it's not necessarily a question of when. It's certainly a question of if Evergrande is unable to repay its debts, because that's where the real problems lie. So obviously there's humanitarian problems, with people not being able to move into their homes and whatnot. And a lot of times in China, it's not necessarily the same as America, where you're buying this, individual home with a white picket fence and there's a yard for you to let your dog run around. I mean, certainly there's a lot of that, but in a lot of these metropolitan areas, we're looking at high rises, condos, apartment complexes. So it's massive works that a lot of people are supposed to be living in. So they're all sort of in the same boat because they're finding themselves there. So from a humanitarian standpoint, that's a problem. But China also has a lot of open real estate. They have over-invested in infrastructure, and there's a lot of open space to put these people. So in terms of it being a Chinese problem, if the Chinese government wanted to do some public investment and house these people in some of these open apartment buildings, which they've been meaning to fill anyways, then I don't see that really being a problem for the rest of us. Where it becomes a problem for the international community is if they are unable to repay their creditors, then that becomes a serious issue, because Evergrande goes under and they have a massive amount of debt, and it's all these people who are now not getting their investments back, which would just create this massive, massive crisis. The bottom line is they're too big for their britches, honestly. They grew too fast, they took on too much, and they need to pay these payments back, and they're just not in the position to do so.
Ben?
Yeah, I mean, what Justin said, I would agree with to a large capacity. Obviously the rules are different when you are employing millions of people and you are literally an essential component of the Chinese economy. And not just the Chinese economy, like on the world stage, like banks in America, all major banks in America are invested in Evergrande to some capacity. Like, this has far-reaching implications that extend beyond China. My bottom line of thinking is, at some point, money has to come from somewhere that's going to change hands that will pay this off, or not. And if that money is not, changing hands and not paying off this debt, where does that leave the people in China? Where does that leave the 3 something million employees of Evergrande? Where does that leave the Chinese real estate market? Like, if China's real estate market crashes, there's big problems, not just in China and for the now billions of people in China, But what about China's neighbors? What about the expansion into the country? If you do a quick search on real estate prices in like industrialized China, it's incredibly expensive. And then, there's open space for miles with no buildings, no houses, no infrastructure whatsoever. And so I think Justin's right. Like, China took a few, leaps as far as, advancement, as far as industrialization, as far as economic growth. And I think they're kind of hitting a point where they're realizing, okay, we don't have the rural infrastructure necessary to support this. I think it's going to be a big issue.
Yeah, on Ben's point, two things. The first one that I will say first and then come back to is that I think the minor problem is the real estate market. The serious problem is the lending issue, and I'll touch on that. But to briefly talk about what Ben brought up in the rural areas, I don't want to call them provinces, and now the terminology is eluding me, but there's, I believe, 12 to 13, potentially 14 provinces within China, areas that are all, they're not independent, but it's a way to break up the country. And all of the economic output, the majority of the population, the majority of prosperity, and practically everything that comes out of the country is centered around the coast. And so if you look at a breakdown, the coastal areas do billions and billions and billions of dollars more worth of revenue, and they house an immense amount more people than the internal areas that are extremely underdeveloped. They hardly produce anything. And China is seriously struggling to get these other areas of the country to be on par with a lot of these prosperous coastal areas, which, is kind of what you were talking about here, Ben. But to touch on what I brought up first is the lending issue is if we take what Ben says and we say major U.S. financial institutions are invested in Evergrand. When you give your money to a bank or you put your money in a checking or a savings account, it is not there. They do not hold it. And then when Ben comes to the bank and says, hey, bank, give me $1,000, they're not giving you your $1,000. The second you give them their money, they are buying securities, they're lending it to other banks, they're investing it somewhere else, they're lending it to other citizens, So in a situation where a company like Evergrand goes under, and there are major creditors like these financial institutions that need their money back in order to service the rest of their clients. I'm not saying that this one thing could be the crippling blow, but it could definitely put a lot of these places in tough spots when, let's say, Evergrande goes under, markets become seriously affected, and large investors come looking for large amounts of cash the banks can't provide. And like Ben said, where does the money come from?
The Great Depression.
The big sad.
So one of Ben's points that he was talking about as far as like putting the Chinese people into government-backed houses, the idea that I was having was that you're leaving these companies out to dry because these companies obviously need money to survive. If you take these people away from the houses that they're trying to buy, then that's basically China saying that we already see the future and we just kind of give up. Because then you're taking people that are going to be put into these houses instead of the Chinese backing these companies to build the rest of their properties. They're taking them out of those properties and putting them into public housing then. So I feel like that's causing a bigger deal in a sense because then the company isn't making money and then the government will eventually either have to bail out or a company will have to then buy out Evergrande potentially, but at a discounted price.
In the context of buying out Evergrande, I'm not sure such a thing is plausible and or possible. Either one. The problem that the Chinese government finds itself in with the Evergrande situation is currently their economy is beginning to stagnate, and they themselves are starting to come to terms with a serious debt issue that's starting to rear its head. Obviously, everyone likes to think about, the America has borrowed so much from the Chinese government, and it's true, we have, but China has also borrowed an immense amount in order to fund a lot of these public works projects, in order to fund, military advancements or compete in the global economy. So their economy is based off of borrowing. So now when they have the largest real estate lender, or not lender, but excuse me, the largest debtor in the country, arguably in the world, Evergrand here, owing $300 billion now at this time, they're in the same exact position as the government. So the government finds itself in this almost like a catch-22. Do we bail out this company that should have been too big to fail and show other Chinese companies that, hey, like, if you decide to really outgrow your guardrails, then don't worry, we'll catch you? Or did they let a 2008 happen? I guess that is the 2008. That's us bailing out our auto companies. Or do they let it crash? And do they not only have to grapple with that, they have to grapple with their already existing debt issue with the government and the fallout in international markets. So there's not really a good path forward here.
Definitely. So, like, to make the comparison, Evergrande owes $300-ish billion, give or take a few billion. When our economic collapse happened in 2008, Lehman Brothers, they owed over $600 billion, so twice the amount, but for mainly single-family homes. So just to show the scale of our economy and China being number two, even being this like 15-ish years ago, just how large our economy was compared to them as far as this current state. So, and then there was also the sub-collapses of all these other companies around them, as far as Lehman Brothers too, that were being bailed out, as well as the auto industry too. So one will affect the other, most definitely. It's the matter of who will be the first one to pull the plug of the companies. Evergrande being the first, who knows? They do have the largest balance sheet as far as being a holding company of real estate in China. So I don't know who number two is. So the same thing with the auto companies as well. There's a whole new sector of EV being put out right now. So it'll be very interesting, because if we will compare it to 2008, this will be years in the making to see what will possibly happen. So, like, if we go off of that thought, then in the next 2 years, if the government will intervene and they do pay off the debtors, then will this cause the rest of the creditors of Chinese real estate to also do the same thing? Say that they fucked up, to then tell the world, hey guys, we were overhedged, and then subsequently what will happen to the U.S.?
What's going across my mind now is what Justin said earlier, is that the growth of the Chinese economy is stagnating right now. And is Evergrande a symptom of that, or is Evergrande the cause of that? And if Evergrande is about to go under, what other Chinese companies that have multinational holdings, are they at risk as well? And if Evergrande is the first, is something else going to follow? And if this does indeed start a chain reaction in the international market, what kind of effects are we going to see here across the ocean? What's going to be the effect in Europe? And if this chain reaction continues to spread, what other sectors are at risk? What other companies are guaranteed to go under if Evergrande, worst case scenario, just completely collapses? What's the worst case scenario that we're looking at here if Evergrande goes under?
You can go ahead and tackle that one first there, pal.
That's a big question. So you're saying, what is the absolute worst case scenario if Evergrande goes under?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Global collapse of the housing market.
We're speculating here.
2008.2.
So I want to preface this by saying, I'm not saying that this. I'm not saying if Evergrande collapses that this will happen. I'm saying that the causation does not necessarily equal the correlation. But worst case scenario, if for whatever reason Evergrande went under, and that was the cause of the beginning of the correction that markets have been looking for, or I guess that's been due to them, if Evergrande was the domino that would cause that correction, then I think that's worst case scenario. Is the market has been doing extraordinary things for an extraordinary amount of time, given all the circumstances at hand. And a lot of that is due to the artificial pumping up of the economy, just pumping it with money and whatnot. And there is a correction due at some point. And if that happens to be because of the Evergrande crisis, I think we see and obviously this is me jumping way ahead to worst case scenario. There's a lot of details that I'm going to skip over. But in that case of the correction, we see people's 401ks getting deleted. We see people's IRAs getting deleted. We see major institutions not being able to lend. We see them struggling to even stay afloat. We see companies having to sell, their assets simply to stay afloat. We see inflation rising. It gets really ugly.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. I think again, just comparing our housing crisis a little over a decade ago, gas prices were $4. Now, from being in Arizona and being back here in Illinois, they're about $3, $3.20 in Arizona. In Illinois, it's about $3.50. So you can definitely see the effects, and not to say that it's the housing market, but there's definitely some inflation type deal that's going on with the world and the supply chain issues.
Mm-hmm.
But if it gets worse, if let's say that they do go, they can't pay back their debtors, and then all of the companies that are subsequently then taken part in this type of investment, then it's like Chase and Citibank and all these other like Barclays, like all these other banks that are like Barclays they're British based, but they still have a large holding in America. All these companies then they're out. Like they have billions of dollars exposed to as well, and like Chase Bank is the largest bank in America, and for like hundreds, they're also one of the oldest too as well. So, but they're also potentially the safest. So, and if you want to look at the safest bank in America and say that hey, they fucked up, then what can you say about the rest of the other banks that are like, well, we're not as big, but we want to risk something as far as to gain something as well as along with it, because they have more to gain than to lose in that way, as far as if they risk a few more $1 billion. So if things do get worse, then nothing's going to be worth anything. Like how inflation in that way, the whole transitory deal going on right now with the Fed and the other discussions right now about a taper rates and things like that. This will only get worse, and then coming to when in the next year or two, because if Evergrande does end up going under, it'll take the good portion of 1 to 2 years. China won't let it happen so soon. There's also safeguards in place the company has because they do have other assets that they can sell off. But the company is still at risk, though. And they have been at risk for the good portion of this last year, and they've known what's going to happen. So if nothing goes on, then oil prices, housing prices, food prices, everything in a whole, from this point will possibly go from like, it's not going to double, but it'll be more expensive than now. And so like, I don't know if we can afford it. Like but think about the average American, just the average worthy citizen. Like how much gas will be for that person then, or how much will it be for rent? It's going to be bad.
I will say I don't necessarily foresee the gas, potentially food, but I don't really see. I mean, the gas I would say is for the most part far removed from Evergrande right now. It's kind of two separate spheres. Obviously, inflation plays into the price of not only gas itself flowing through the company, like Exxon or Dutch Royal Shell, but the cost of a barrel at the first stop is. That's all.
I agree with Justin.
Situation going on there.
I find it unlikely that oil barons in the Middle East care too greatly about Evergrande facing economic collapse. And maybe that's naive of me, and I'm sure at some point there is that overlap. But I would urge you to look a little more deeply, especially when you're talking about Illinois gas prices. Like Illinois has passed some pretty personally heinous taxes on gas and on like everything, as far as like you need to pay quadruple what other states pay for your license plate sticker every year, and for every mile that you drive you have to pay a certain number of pennies. Like that is a local issue, and obviously the state of Illinois is no joke on the U.S. economy when you start talking about things like Chicago and St. Louis, and even like, again, I can get into Illinois because I'm from there, but if you're not from Illinois, like you don't know other than Chicago what's in Illinois. Yeah. But it's primarily rural. And so you're seeing actually very similar to what Virginia just experienced, where you're seeing this huge schism between political orientation as a state and the majority of land ownership. And so Virginia just flipped red in its most recent election.
Yes,
And it was a big shock to a lot of people because Richmond is so blue. Like the surrounding and city of Richmond is a very liberal place, and there's a lot of historical backing for that. But it was such an interesting thing, and you travel 15 minutes out of Richmond, and all of a sudden you're in farms, you're in forests that people have lived in for hundreds of years, and their families, like, they can point to their gravestones on their property. Like, you're getting into this divide of where issues are no longer dependent entirely on overseas markets. And so Illinois is a weird case, but I mean, yeah, obviously inflation's happening. I made less money this year than I did last year simply because if my income didn't go up, everything else did. So it's one of these situations that we as a country are having to deal with. When I heard what you were saying about like the potential economic collapse and like the struggle, what immediately came to mind for me was in other instances where a country experiences hyperinflation, like what are the potential avenues out of hyperinflation? Like if Evergrand tanks and that tanks the Chinese economy in a way that's so significant that now their money is worth less than it was before in a significant way. I mean, the instances that came to mind for me are Germany after World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
Like burning money because it's cheaper to burn money than it is to burn wood or paper.
Mm-hmm.
And if it gets to that point, is war the necessary, is conquest for wealth, resources the answer? I don't think so. I don't think that's a realistic extrapolation.
We'll smiling over here. Let him take a shot.
Well, and that again, that's where my mind immediately goes, is that's one way to deal with it. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think the world stage is not set for that. I don't know. It seems like it could be a dark time to move forward.
I feel like we could really play around with the idea of this worst case scenario leading to an economic collapse. And to bounce off what Ben said with war and inflation and all that, if you look at the historical trends, it takes global wars and total mobilization of entire continents, not countries, but continents, to produce the kind of economic mess that Germany was left in post-World War I and World War II. I mean, there are a few brave historians who have tried to delve into the whole reparations after World War I, and World War II was even more of a mess. But when Ben is right, I have family members who are from Germany and lived through that era, and they had a story where if you saw a basket of Deutschmarks sitting on the street, you would take the basket and leave the Deutschmarks because it was absolutely worthless. A loaf of bread was worth $1 billion with a B Deutschmarks. Like their dollar was as close to zero as you can get without it actually being zero. But
have you guys seen the Rick and Morty episode where Rick topples the galactic government by changing their single centralized currency from being worth one to none of itself?
And it's
chaos.
So that I don't know if that worst case scenario is it's not possible for the U.S. dollar to reach a value of zero because of Evergrand. But it would be kind of fun to play with that idea where if Evergrand collapses and the rest of the economy by hook or by crook just collapses with it, then there would be war, there would be riots, there would be lines around the block for food stamps. People would stop driving because they wouldn't be able to afford gas if there's even gas available. Then
man, these EVs are looking more and more desirable right now.
Assuming that they're able to keep manufacturing them at this point. Because if, and this is a big if, Evergrand takes a third of the world economy with it for some reason, then who's to say that Rivian in Bloomington is going to be able to keep making their electronic trucks? They're going to see unemployment go up, you're going to see hyperinflation, and, it's really just going to be an absolute free-for-all in terms of total collapse.
Yeah, I completely agree with Will, and I think another important thing to think about is since post World War II and contemporary history, modern history, within the past, 30 to 40 years, globalism has become such a prominent, I don't want to say part, but I guess idea or concept within the world economy where it's, I say nearly impossible because I don't want to rule it out, but nearly impossible for one single country to be entirely self-sufficient, which is why um, even minor events in other countries have such a significant effect on uh, economies halfway across the globe. But in that same token, or on the same side of that coin, it's also important to note that not every single thing that happens will affect every single sector
Industry,
of the market. And inflation, especially, hyperinflation, especially, usually starts out as a country specific problem. If you look at in modern terms, Venezuela is number one, where last time I checked, arguably 40% of Venezuelans are living below the poverty line, and they're starting to experience this sort of 1920s, 1930s Germany situation where you can't even pay for food or you can't even pay for bread.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see it with Turkey and the Turkish lira, where as we talk about this now, I don't know what today is, November 22nd, 2021, the Fed, the European Central Bank, the England's central bank, we're all starting to tighten monetary policy. Now, I want to specify that the EU is lagging behind that, which has its own implications. But a standout is Turkey's central bank, and they're not. They're slashing interest rates. Erdogan feels like the easiest way to fight inflation is with low interest rates. And so the lira has dropped by 30 to 40% this year alone. And it's still just a Turkey problem. It's causing internal problems. It's certainly not affecting the dollar by any means. But where the globalism aspect comes into play is it can't stay a singular country problem forever, because the second the people are fed up, or the second, bread costs $1 billion, what do you do? Maybe we start looking at somebody else's borders.
I wanna weigh in on a few things here. One thing that makes me just think in a funny, messed up way is, if Evergrand's $300 billion in debt, they just need to wait a little while and get some loaves of bread and just pay it off, bro. If bread's $1 billion, show up with 300 loaves of bread. But I think one thing that really is evident here is the scale of your country's economy is important when you're having this discussion, because here we are weighing the toll on the U.S. economy that a problem in China is going to have, when this Turkish currency issue has been going on all year, and before hopping on this podcast, I had not heard one single thing about it. And I think it really talks to the scale and the extent to which China and U.S.'s economies are linked in a way that, like, the Turkish economy just couldn't hope to replicate. I think just the total, value there is not on the same par whatsoever. Another thing that really kind of piqued my interest with what we were talking about is, in this hypothetical collapse, you get really deep into the territory of government reliance. And obviously, when the U.S. experienced the Great Depression and the 2008 collapse, the government stepped in to help in massive ways that, are frankly un-American by conservative standards,
arguably unconstitutional.
Yeah. And nobody cared when everybody was starving, and FDR was like, free food, free, we're gonna pay you to work even though there's no money, like
WPA.
And again, there's been a massive benefit to that. The majority of rural America was built during the Great Depression. Almost all country roads, almost all bridges, things that did not need to be done got done because it was an effort to stimulate the economy. And obviously World War II was like the slam dunk that really mobilized the U.S. workforce and got things back up and running in a massive way. But it was these social programs that for 3 terms of FDR's presidency really attempted to combat this inflation, this struggle and this collapse. And so I'm curious. Obviously, in 2008, we got bailed out. The automotive industry got bailed out. Ford was the only U.S. car manufacturer that wasn't needing the bailout. To what extent can China's government do that without creating new problems down the road?
One quick note I want to say was that the Hoover Dam that was built with American debt, and I think in like the early 2000s, it finally started to pay for itself. Does anybody have any like insight on this?
I cannot comment on that. I'm sorry.
Okay. It's so no, like I remember this being like the start of like the story that I read was this was years ago. Was the Hoover Dam was being built under FDR, and Hoover obviously finished it, but that they were just printing off money because they were just wanting to complete all these American projects, and that finally in like I would have to be fact checked.
Well, Hoover was president before FDR.
Well, okay, I'm getting my president, and then Truman was after. Okay, and then that's why I'm getting mixed up. Okay, so Hoover finished the dam, and then it was decades later that it finally started to pay for itself. But just the idea that alone that we started putting up a bunch of money and inflation started to happen, and then eventually it came to right. That's a little point I wanted to make. But to lead into Justin's idea about Turkey, I want to compare that to more so of the American economy, because we did the same deal, is that we slash rates just to combat with the coronavirus and also with all like just our debt in a sense then. But is Turkey ahead of the curve in this? Because most countries slashed rates during the last year or so, but Turkey just continued.
During the last what?
Like during the last year or so, right?
Yes.
Okay, so if they slash rates then, but inflation is taking more of a hold, they're lending out more money now than ever because more people are looking at the slashing of rates as an investment opportunity. If only in the sense that things get worse, are they ahead of the curve?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Why?
Why?
I feel very strongly about that. Well, okay, so you cannot. I'm sure you can in some convoluted way, but in a traditional economic sense, you cannot combat inflation with more spending because that's the problem. Inflation itself, from a consumer standpoint, is when the economy is at its peak and your dollar cannot do anything more for you. Demand is high and you cannot increase your spending power. So from a government standpoint, if Turkey is consistently slashing rates and they're putting more money into the hands of the people, that's where we're running into problems. Is if the lira in this hypothetical situation is at its max value right now and we're just putting more of it out, we're just stimulating the economy, I guess, but we're not going anywhere. We're spinning our wheels and they're digging themselves a deeper hole. The reason that you tighten monetary policy and you instead of selling securities, as a financial institution, like for the Fed, for example, when the Fed tightens rates tightens monetary policy, they are no longer lending. They're no longer buying. They're selling. Or if you look at a bank or any sort of big company, like you are opting to buy bonds, whereas like they want to. In times of economic upturn, they're buying from you. They want to hold the securities. They want to put the money in your hand. Mm-hmm. So if you want to correct that, you need people to buy things like bonds or preferred stock, or you need them to hold on to something and control the flow of money. And if the flow of money is not stopping and you're simply just increasing it, you're giving yourself a worse problem, arguably.
Okay, and then to kind of like cap off your point, then, and let's say to the beginning of where I said, well, things get worse. If they do get worse, then what happens when buyers are forced to pay back this debt that they have? Because if things keep getting worse, then that money will be even more scarce. So then, to your point, that I understand more so about how that would work.
So, what debt would buyers have in this scenario?
Well, the ones who are looking at the lira because everything is so devalued then, because of the inflation that's going on, they're looking at the opportunity of an upturn. Mm-hmm. Same thing with people investing in America. With our rates being so low, they're looking at us right now as being, hey guys, you're only at a a 1.5% interest rate compared to a 3.5% a couple of years ago. That's
Mhm.
better for us because we're getting a more secure bet. So they're looking at the lira then being like, oh, a couple of years ago, look at how much it was compared to now. Then so, but if things get worse, than it was previous than what it is currently right now, then those countries will be overextended, and then they'll be forced to pay back all these people. But then their countries as well will be affected by hyperinflation. And then what's to say that they will actually pay back their investors?
So what are the
So
key takeaways here? From
go
Turkey
ahead.
lira?
The key takeaway is what?
What are the key
In Turkey.
takeaways from Turkey in the lira?
One of the key takeaways from Turkey are that don't try to fight inflation by putting more money in the hands of the people. I think the serious takeaway is if your currency is struggling, a weak currency equals a trade surplus. A strong currency equals a trade deficit. And by that, I mean, when your currency is weak, other countries are more willing to, well, not more willing to, it's easier for them to purchase your products or purchase your services because if $1 is worth 30 lira, I'm buying everything I can out of Turkey if I'm the U.S. government because I'm getting everything for cheap. Whereas if you have a uh, strong international currency, you're kind of competing more on a level playing field where it's like, hey, look, if the dollar is what I need to stack up against, and $1 is only worth 5 lira, then I'm going to be getting more bang for my buck on the international stage because we're actually going to have more money. If the lira is worth nothing, then yeah, you're going to be exporting more, and hopefully that's going to help stimulate your economy because you're getting back on track. But from a currency standpoint and what you're going to be able to purchase outside of your own borders, even within it, it's doing nothing for you. If that makes sense.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jared.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
One of the things that this really brings to my mind is I have two big points here, and I do want to touch on them both. When we're talking about what happens when an economy collapses, the thing that immediately pops into my mind is it bad if an economy collapses? Now, obviously, everybody's like, well, yeah, obviously this is terrible and there's massive repercussions. And I hear what you're saying, but hear me out. If it was bad to begin with, do we let it die and start over?
I think it depends on your definition of bad.
Well, and that's obviously
And I'll
incredibly
elaborate on
subjective.
that point by like what you have at stake if this economy in question collapses. Because if you technically don't lose anything or even perhaps pose to gain something, then it becomes a different question entirely.
Well, and I think it was the capitalist in me that was instantly like, well, if it was doomed to die, should we let it die, or should we capitalize on the market as it dies and cash in when the Chinese real estate market crashes and it's not $4,000 per square meter in an apartment in China? So that was my first question, and I do want to touch on that a little bit more. Like, what would happen if the Chinese economy totally restructured? If Evergrand collapses and China's like, you know what, F it, we're gonna try something different.
If Evergrand restructures or if the Chinese government restructures?
Well, ultimately Evergrand, functions under the Chinese government, or the Chinese economy. It would be one or the other. It wouldn't be both.
Oh, well, if Evergrand restructured, I would say if the government restructured, but
I have to step away for a moment. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I'm going to throw this out there and step away for about 2 minutes. I'm going to take it the step up and talk about the Chinese government. This kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier briefly about the different sectors of the country itself and how the coastal ones are much more economically prosperous. Any of the three of you or any of our viewers, if you're looking for an absolutely fantastic YouTube channel on geopolitical happenings, it's called Caspian Report.
I second this.
It is fantastic. So definitely watch that if you're looking for some good tips or some great info on what's going on in the world. But to think about is kind of Caspian, like the Caspian Sea report, like report card.
Great YouTube channel, yes.
So basically, if the Chinese economy restructured, it's huge, like disastrous trouble for the country itself. That means practically upheaval of the entirety of what they're built upon, and it's probably pretty bad news for us. To touch on the first part of what I'm saying, China cannot switch from communism. Like they cannot. They physically cannot. The economic system that, and I don't mean it because like they need it to redistribute wealth and make sure everybody's equal, because not everybody's equal in China, and they don't need it for this authoritarian grip, but for this straight up survival of their state. The inner sections of their country are not on the same level economically, from a population standpoint, from a technological standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint. They cannot survive without the public investment that can be redistributed through the communist system. And so if China was to restructure and say, hey, like, what up? We're capitalists now. It might work, but you're practically going to have an implosion of the inside part of the country, where if they're not receiving funding or they're not receiving investments or they're not growing, I mean, it's going to be absolute anarchy. So communism is communism is critical to their survival, not from an ideological standpoint, not because they're like, we're China, we're communist. Straight up from a dollar standpoint, I mean, the inner parts of the country would cease to have any value whatsoever if they were not thriving underneath. And they're not thriving if they were not being subsidized through a communist system. Be back.
Okay. To Justin's point then about the capitalistic, the communistic standpoint, then what Evergrand did and threatened to do to its employees was that if their employees did not invest their own money into the company, they would be fired. In a capitalistic economy, the company would just not do anything. They would just go, all right, guys, we tried. But under the Chinese rule and under their communistic government, they wanted the people who made the company, in the sense who built these fucking apartments, to go, no. It was our fault in a way. Let's give back our hard-earned money for our families and whatever else that we're going to spend it on to you, so you can continue to prop us up. That's not how it should work, unfortunately.
Well,
my job now did that. I'd be like, no, peace. Yeah.
Well,
sorry.
and I think that's a very American perspective. And I think that when you start talking about different cultures with different political organizations, with different cultural expectations, you need to be very careful to understand that our American values do not translate across country lines, across, continent lines.
Definitely.
And that's something that we definitely experienced when we fought Japan during World War II. Like, they did not fight or function like regular people that we were used to interacting with. Like, if they were a reasonable people or a reasonable country, the World War II would have been over in 1943 for Japan. Like, they'd have been like, all right, like, the writing's on the wall. Like, if F it, we don't want to get, nuked. But they hung in there because their culture demanded it. Their society was set up in a way that would not allow for any other option other than total destruction. And I think it's interesting when you start talking about China, like, again, obviously, like, if I was working at a company and the company was like, shoot, Ben, we fudged the numbers a little bit, we goofed. Turns out we're actually $300 billion in debt. So you're not getting paid. Oh, and also you need to pay us, otherwise you're fired. As an American, I'm like, peace.
Yeah. Justin,
I'll go somewhere else. But
pose the question to Justin, please. Can you pose that question to Justin?
The question that I pose?
Like, just the idea that he was gone, since he was gone.
Yeah. So basically, Justin, since you left, Jarod and I have been kind of discussing in China this idea that, obviously communism is crucial to the Chinese economy and honestly just the Chinese state. Jarod was discussing like, hey, like, you know, the dissatisfaction, the disservice that you would feel if the company you worked for was like, hey, we can't pay you and you actually have to invest your own money into us, otherwise you're fired. You know, from an American perspective, it's like, I'm not interested in that. Like that's a lose-lose for me. Like, why would I not just move on to another opportunity elsewhere? And I kind of went on a tangent, but I attempted to exemplify that culturally and societally, we're not the same. You know, you can't take American values, American understandings of economics, of politics, of merit, of your job, and apply that to China or really any country. Like, even in the UK, there's massive differences in the way that we look at jobs and the way that we look at duty to your, you know, obligation to your employer. The tangent I went on was Japan during World War II. You know, their society would not allow them to lose World War II. Like they couldn't surrender, because if they surrendered, they would go against the grain of every single thing they'd ever built their society upon. And that's why it destroyed Japan to lose.
I'd like to make this point to say that it's not that they wouldn't surrender. Ben is right. They could not surrender.
Yeah, they literally, like, and again, I could literally go into this for a very long period of time, but they sent their navy, they sent their navy into literally a firing squad because they wanted an honorable end, because they couldn't spare the oil for the planes and the manufacturing and the boats, and they're like, the Navy had to beg. They're like, please let us go kill ourselves, like give an honorable fight to the end. Like what a crazy notion for the soldiers of the Navy to write their officer and say, we do not worry about dying. That's not what concerns us. What concerns us is that we are dying and achieving nothing. At least give us an honorable mission to go to an honorable end too. Can you imagine telling your U.S. battleship, hey guys, we're effed, but we're going to go and fight their entire Navy with just this one ship? They're going to say, no.
There
was, I think, the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War echoes differently in the West than it does in the East. Because when you have Western nations like the United States and basically anybody in Western Europe, where we place value on the lives of our soldiers, and it is the primary initiative of officers and leaders in war to bring the soldiers home alive and hopefully in one piece, then when you field an army of those kind of soldiers with those kind of officers against an army where they have zero regard for human life whatsoever, it functions very differently. General Zhukov from the Red Army in World War II is quoted as saying, when his army is attacking an objective and encounters a minefield, they attack as if the minefield were not there. How do you win against an army that is willing to spend lives as if it were ammunition?
Well, it's a tough equation, because it literally comes down to different values and how you fight. That's part of the reason why Germany struggled so massively against Russia the USSR during World War I and World War II. They could not achieve a military victory that demoralized Russia, because suffering and loss is so ingrained in the culture that it was acceptable. You know, the idea that 5 Russians would run into battle, the first guy armed with a gun and the next 4 with bullets, like, when comrade in front of you dies, pick up the gun until it's your turn. Like, that's not a Western mentality. That's this is for my state.
A war crime.
Yeah.
It's a war crime unless you win, because check the ledger, bro. Russia won. Like, Germany literally couldn't produce enough bullets to kill the Russians that were storming across their borders.
I will say that the USSR won World War II for us on our Western Front, or I'm sorry, actually on the Western Front, because of how they were engaged and the rates of attrition when they were fighting on the Eastern Front.
It's not to say that America couldn't, and with Britain, couldn't have won World War II.
I don't think it's possible that they would have
won. The
won.
United States and Great Britain could not have won World War II in Europe without the help of the USSR.
Vice versa. If we did not enter the war and they fought the USSR on their own, I don't think they would have won.
That's also facts. And so here's the issue. we provided the necessary distraction to allow the USSR to level up. All right. In Stalingrad, the USSR gained a bunch of bonus EXP that they bought DLC packages for.
Doritos,
really,
Mountain Dew, yeah.
But no, I mean, and again, we're kind of off topic here, but it really, the point is, our cultural and societal values do not correlate across the board. You know, in Japan, even now, in many respects, if you get a job in Japan, that is your lifetime career. Like, even if you goof, and I mean like F up bad, like Evergrand, not Evergrand bad, but like the company won't fire you.
No,
because it's dishonorable to you and it's dishonorable to the company for hiring someone that's worthy of firing. And so like they'll reduce your role in the company, but it's one of these things where societally, like, you go into a job knowing that, you know, barring murder, you're going to work there.
They make you live with it.
Well, and not only do you have to live with it, but it's part of that culture. You know, you can build excellence if you devote yourself for 50 years to doing something. Like after World War II, when Japan was rebuilding, like Japan devoted itself to high quality material, like buildings, like not buildings, but like products, which is, the world laughed because Japan was like the headquarters of cheap knockoffs, which is now China. Like China mass produces like garbage, you know, and that's not a knock. Like, it's just that there's a market there. But Japan now produces Sony. They produce, you know, Nissans, like, you know, all these wonderful things that are like highly regarded in the engineering world. And they built that legacy as a society. You know, how many jobs have you had, you know, now that you're 25? Like, I've had like 8 jobs, you know.
Japan is one of the world's largest economies for a good reason.
I mean, they thrive on excellence from a population standpoint. From no standpoint should they be at the economic, you know, prowess that they have. It's just like their military in World War II. They punch above their weight class because they can devote their society to it. It's like in Civ when you allot extra points to your social, you know. Terrible
nukes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys are aware, but Japan is the world. I mean, behind the U.S. and China, it's Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Hell yeah, brother!
For a while, it was China. It was Japan above China, like during like the 70s and 90s. So it took a very long time for China to catch up like they did.
Took Fast and Furious to really drop the stock in Japanese engineering.
Yeah, as soon as John Cena started speaking Mandarin, just.
Yeah. So, to bring us sort of back on track, Ben, to go all the way back, I think it's important that you said, you know, much like when you look at historical events and you can't look at it through a contemporary lens, you have to look at it through the lens of the time. If you're going for a sense of understanding, you know, and you're removing opinion from it and you're going from a simple sense of understanding to understand another culture, you have to look at it through that culture. You know, you can't judge China based off of American values. You have to try to understand from a Chinese perspective. And obviously there are fundamental differences. There probably always will be. But from an economic standpoint, sometimes even within your own culture, I think when you're a little too overzealous with what your country is founded upon or what pillars it stands on, that can still hurt you. You know, even if you throw yourself wholeheartedly. I mean, if you look at America, obviously the idea of individualism and exceptionalism has left millions of people in the States homeless. You know, the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, that certainly hurt a lot of people because a lot of people get left behind. But the same thing in China that we've seen recently this year, the idea of with communism, the state being so heavily involved in business, Xi Jinping's push to almost go back to sort of a Maoist grip on the economy has gotten a lot of pushback from not only Chinese businesses that play on the big scale, but also international businesses and international economies, because to those businesses that have been almost given like I guess the best way we can describe it is like glasnost, you know, if we look at the Soviet Union, like there's this sense of openness. We're picking up some capitalistic tendencies and they've been allowed to play by Western rules a little bit and they start to expand. if you're wondering if your government's going to start dipping their hands in your finances and your operations more heavily, that's going to hurt you financially. And on an international stage, if I'm an international investor, especially if I'm a lending institution or some kind of big business looking to invest in China, that's going to hurt my outlook because I have no idea if I wake up tomorrow and the government decided to say, Tencent, for example, the international gaming company, or Alibaba, all this drama with Jack Ma, they decide like, hey man, you're doing a little too much, or you've got a little too much of the market capitalization, or you need to pay more taxes. My investment might go down the toilet. So
which Alibaba did for a good portion of the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So go ahead, Ben. Another question was posed for you.
I'm gonna be honest. I was listening, but just in case listening again, because I wasn't listening.
So to summarize, I would say it's important to use the correct lens when you're trying to understand something, whether it's a historical lens or a cultural lens.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remove the ethics from it because you can make an ethical argument, but from a simple sense of understanding, you have to use the right lens.
Right.
And if we do that and look at China with the crackdown in the economy, my point was sometimes if you stick to your idea, or if you're a little overzealous with the way you implement your ideology, it might hurt you or hinder you more so than it is gonna help you.
Yeah. That's a very interesting point. And I think there's and again, as someone who enjoys history, I think there's always a historical example of something. The USSR is like the last great communist power to fall that comes to my mind. I'm sure there's some other socialist country that's happening.
Probably the only. I mean, great. You're saying great.
Right, the only great. And so, when you talk about the decline of the USSR and their economy and their society, there's so many factors that go into it that from a Western perspective just don't make sense. Like, why would you not abandon ship? Why would you not do this? Why would you not change this? I think it's something similar in China where like they are dedicated to this approach that they have. And there's certain things that they have to do, as you said earlier, for the security and the benefit of the state. Like China cannot risk revolution. They cannot risk revolt, like
it's not like they're strangers to it.
Well, and I mean, it's not like they're strangers to it, but
last year.
Let's keep Hong Kong to a minimum. We don't get shadow banned in China.
Allegedly. I look at Hong Kong last year.
I hope my family's okay.
Yeah.
China's no stranger to these sorts of influences, but they can respond and move their weight in ways that America can't. Like, can you imagine if part of the United States broke away and we're like, we're an independent nation, and the U.S. was like,
every year.
No, they're not. But
we would fight a war to bring them back.
We've
done it. We did it once.
Win too.
I mean, back to back. No.
Back-to-back Civil War champs.
Three-time champs, baby.
Repeat bitch like LeBron and the fucking Miami Heat.
No, but like if some contingent of the United States of America broke off, I guarantee we would mobilize, and we would not declare war. We would just march back in and we would suppress a rebellion. Because if Congress declared war on this country, using air quotes here,
it legitimizes them.
It legitimizes them. It gives them legitimacy. And we did not declare war on the Confederacy when they seceded.
Can we just talk about how? And again, I really do want to weigh back in on what you said, because what you said is awesome. Can we just talk about how like Donald Trump, when he became president, like called like the president of like Taiwan or whatever, and it was like, oh, thank you. Am I getting that right? Was it Taiwan or was it Hong Kong or? Somebody called Donald Trump after he became president, and you can look this up. This is true. And he answered the phone call and like accepted their thanks on him becoming the president, except like he wasn't supposed to recognize their country on like the world stage. This was a big snafu in his early presidency. Look this up.
Taiwan.
Yeah, it for sure was. But look this up. This is hilarious.
Yeah, that's because that's China operates on a one China policy. And the current state of existence, really, of Taiwan kind of invalidates that whole thing, because if China was only supposed to be one China, then Taiwan as a separate political entity would not exist.
Mm-hmm.
And the United States also supports a one China policy, which is why Biden and every other president since China became communist has not supported Taiwanese independence, because the United States believes that the government in Taiwan is the legitimate government of all of China. But we're doing all of our business with the illegitimate government of China, who controls 98% of China, really, if you include Taiwan. So we don't support Taiwanese independence because we believe that the government of Taiwan is the legitimate government of China.
So I hear what you're saying. I kind of want to take it back to the Civil War analogy.
All right, bring it.
You guys ready for the rabbit hole?
I'm ready.
We've been on it.
I'm ready.
We've been
Can I
on it
just?
for a
Can I
while.
just? I'd like to apologize to everyone watching and or listening at this point. If you came looking for globalism, apparently now
We're talking about
Prepare.
the U.S.
We're just going to title this episode of it's the free for all number one.
Yeah.
There we go.
Just
All right.
shits. That's all it is.
Show me the
Just
rabbit
a-
hole.
hit us with it.
All right. If the U.S. was to experience a civil war similar to how it did in the year 1859, 1860.
1861.
1865.
All right. All I'm saying is,
You fucking dorks.
all I'm saying is that the United States is in a position that would uniquely struggle. Okay. And I think it's different if this was to happen in China, or if this was to happen in, a country that is not under Western ideology. Because and we'll use Texas because Texas is the stereotypical, we were our own country once, we're better than the rest of the nation. I used to hate people from Texas, and now I can kind of see it. I'm like, all right, Texas seems like a cool place. But it is difficult for me to imagine that if the National Guard was mobilized, or, Texas declares its independence and the U.S. military is like, I think not, would the U.S. military march on Texas and execute what had been only recently U.S. citizens?
They better.
No, they won't.
I don't think they would.
They would not.
100%. I don't think they would. I
They will not.
think Texas would call their bluff, and the U.S. government would be in a horrible situation of deciding, do we, and this is always the argument, like, well, the people can't win when the military has AC-130s, and it's like, that's fair. Like, I can't shoot down an AC-130, but will the guy that's piloting that AC-130 open fire on the suburbs of Texas?
No.
I don't believe it's doable. Now, if
Any-
something like this, hey, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt you, but there's a second half to this.
If Texas or any other state or group of states is seceded from the Union and we marched on them with the intent of waging war, our goals would be to destroy their armies and the ability to supply said armies and bring our brothers and sisters back into the fold. Because once we start killing Texans for believing that they are Texan and not American, then it becomes something completely different. We can preface this with examples from the Civil War. There's correspondence between George B. McClellan and Abraham Lincoln arguing about what the whole goal of the Civil War was going to be in 1861. Do we attack cities and kill civilians, or do we just attack their armies and destroy their ability to defend themselves and leave them no other option but to reintegrate? And that's what I believe would happen if there was going to be a second American Civil War, is we would aim to destroy their armies, and figuratively behead the political leadership, and then bring them back into the Union and reintegrate.
I hear what you're saying, and I don't want to cut this discourse short. My follow-up to that is, if a large faction in China was to rebel or to speak out or try and say, hey, we no longer want it, like, we want to go join Taiwan, or we want to go do our own thing in this province, I think China is in a unique position to say, we're going to mobilize our military against you. Oh, and we're going to execute all of you.
Again, like you said, from the different cultures, I agree with that. As far as Americans, we wouldn't go out and kill other Americans, but from the Chinese standpoint, I'm not going to put that idea off the table. That does sound possible.
Well, and it's not even necessarily that the Chinese citizens and the Chinese brothers and everybody in the military is okay with it. It's almost as though like their society allows for that, whereas ours would not. Like we would hope that like reason would win out in the hearts of the soldiers, and they would go to the firing lines and just put their weapons down and hug their brother, like whatever. Like this magical idea that like morality wins. It's a crucial part of like Western belief, like we have to believe that we're ethical and that we're good. And I just don't think that exists elsewhere in the world. Like I think in Russia, like people in Russia are keenly aware, and also in China, like you talk about like the 50 million plus people that were killed during like communist China's, what was the dude's name? Mao
Zedong.
Dude, can you imagine 1 in 6, 1 in 7 of every single person in the U.S. getting killed during the reign of one dude?
A lot of people.
No, I can't.
Well, you also said reign, and nobody reigns in the U.S. So
Make it
there is a reason why China would do that, and the United States, for example, would not. There is no Bill of Rights in China. There are no natural rights or civil rights in China that are guaranteed to you by the state. And that's part of the reason why the United States wouldn't execute rebels, is because if we don't give them legitimacy, then in our eyes, those rebels are still American citizens and privy to the natural rights and civil rights that are guaranteed to them by the Bill of Rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it is only until that we recognize their sovereignty that we're able to go in and then just wipe the floor with the civilian population. But in China, yes, absolutely, they do have the legal authority to do that. Whether or not they would win in the court of public opinion is something completely different. But
well, I think unfortunately, public opinion's proven itself not to be a good enough court of decision to stop things. Like China's on the back foot for a lot of things right now in the court of public opinion. Like you start talking about like the Uyghurs, like basically the concentration camps they're in. Like
whose public opinion?
My opinion.
No, that's exactly right. It's people like us, but it kind of raises the question where what can we do about it? Yes, well, we can get online and we can record a video of us complaining about how awful the Chinese regime is for the Muslims in Central Asia. But they're like, not one of us are going to take up arms, fly over there, and demand liberation for the Uyghurs. It's not going to happen, and nobody is ever going to do that. And there's nobody in the United States government that's going to do that because we have too much at stake. Why should anybody in charge in the United States care about the plight of the Uyghurs? Why? Why should they? It's terrible, and it's a humanitarian crisis, and it's awful that it's happening. And I hope that it's actually all fake and it's been blown out of proportion. But in a real sense, why should we care?
I think and I don't mean this like in a satirical manner. I mean this like straight up, and that's what makes it so precarious, or is you should care because it's the right thing. But that's exactly what I mean. Like, why does a nation have to act simply on the grounds of because it's right? Because like what's
a nice thing to do,
right? Well, exactly. Sorry, Ben. I just want to make sure I get the chance to say I might be on the opposite side of the fence here. It sounds like I kind of am from what you folks are saying. I mean, I don't know what your personal opinions are. I feel very strongly about if there was some sort of insurrection in the United States, I would hope that we executed those people. Not because, I have absolute disdain for people who advocate for splitting the union. And I think a lot of people don't understand like the Boogaloo Boys and like people who are like, oh, my rights, like we need a civil war, like we need our own nation. That's cool, man. How are you going to feel when your telephone lines are cut? How are you going to feel when you can't talk to your family? How are you going to feel when you're getting gunned down by the military? How are you going to feel when you're starving? Like people advocate for these things and they have no idea what civil war means. You literally don't know what that situation is, which is also why, like, if you're going to try to degrade or break away from a country that where you actually have a Bill of Rights and you actually have these principles that have been awarded to you. Like, America is not perfect, but to try to fucking break away and create something that I don't know, it just enrages me, dude. I don't have any sympathy for Confederate sympathizers. Like, this is one thing I feel super strong about. Like, no love, zero love.
I hear everything you say, and please hear me. I feel very strongly in many of the ways.
But
No, there's no but coming,
okay.
because it's the thing. I am 100% not a Confederate sympathizer. I disagree vehemently with all of their beliefs. I will argue with anybody that tries to tell me that the Civil War was a battle about states' rights. You just got to hit them with the follow-up. And you're like, oh, yeah, state right to do what, mother trucker? It's one of those things. Like, and again, Lori, if you're watching this, my ex-girlfriend Lori was from Texas, and she was like Texas-centric. Like, she would tell me all the time, like, Texas could break away. They have everything they need. They have the oil fields, And I was like, no! Like, what are you going to do when Verizon no longer services your territory? What are you going to
do when you figure out the Texas oil fields are not the Texas oil fields? They're America's oil fields, and they're coming back for them. Like,
we fought wars in the Middle East for 20 years. You think we're not going to invade Texas over their oil if they secede?
Right. Well, we can get into that, but it's one of these things where, like, they have this faux sense of belief. Like, I agree very much with Justin where he says America is far from perfect, but I think America is by far the best country on this earth, and they are by far doing the most and above and beyond the call of duty and in the works of humanitarianism, in the works of righting wrongs and enforcing regulation on those that would do worse. The world would be absolutely for the worst if America did not exist. And
yes, I would definitely agree with that. I would just say, I always think of the best thing that sums up my views. If you guys have ever seen the show on HBO, The Newsroom, the opening scene where the main character says, like, America is not the greatest country on earth, but it used to be, and it could be, and it should be. That's how I feel. Not in a selfish way or in like a America, like, exceptionalist way, but just, we have the capability, we have the means, we have the values. We could be the greatest country on earth, but we haven't rectified or come to terms with a lot of things we need to. We haven't invested in our people the way we need to. We need to educate our kids more. We need to worry about ourselves more. We need to heal from what happened 2016 to 2020, arguably 2021 included. Like, there's a lot that needs to happen at home for America to truly be great again. And so, I'm a big proponent and a big believer in America itself and the values and how I interpret them. But I think we need to reclaim those from who hijacked them and truly, distribute those values and make them true for everybody.
I disagree.
Okay.
You know what, Justin? Will just took everything you said and just threw it away.
All right, Will, hit me with it.
I think America is the greatest country in the world, and it used to be the greatest country in the world, and it will continue to be, or at least it should be our goal to perpetuate the hegemony that we maintain over our planet. If people in the United States have some of the highest standards of living in the entire history of the world. And when you talk about political divisions, especially when it comes to 2016, I think it's, I'll say it. I think it's a good thing that we can clash and that we can say what we want and we can bash the leadership and we can drag other people through the mud without any political ramifications whatsoever. Because I can say on this podcast that I wish death upon the president, and I will not disappear. I will be back tomorrow, and I'll be back working at my job, and I'll still be studying at my university, and nothing bad is going to happen to me, except maybe some guy who hears me and doesn't like what I have to say. And then, of course, my problem is with him and not with the state itself.
So
spicy.
That is spicy.
I'm
gonna take it in a different direction. But I don't want to just downplay what you just said, Will, and I also don't want to downplay what you said, Justin. Like, each of you aired out some very interesting bases for why you believe what you believe about this country. And I'm going to say, personally, I'm going to defend this, that I also believe that America is the greatest country in the world. I do not believe that America is, I'm not sucking the dick of America too hard here. Like, America has its own flaws. There's a lot of things that need massive improvement. What I agree with in a lot of ways with what Justin said and what that guy said in that video, because I've seen that video and it's powerful. Like, it's a call to action for America to step up. Like, it's in the position to do so, but you're right. There's a lot of things that need to happen. Now, the basis for all of this, and I actually had this conversation with someone 2 days ago on the phone. I was talking about, like, people don't understand in America what the rest of the world is like. Like in Canada, you can go to jail for making jokes about the government, or heaven forbid you insult somebody from the LGBT community. Like, what's a not so funny joke here in most settings is jail time. Like, 100%.
In the right circumstance. I mean, it's not like you make a joke and they're sending you to prison.
Nah, dude. Check your facts. I encourage you to dig into this. Like, there's a lot of issues.
Ben's right. Like, America, in a sense, like, is the best country. And, like, to the credit, when I was like 17 or 18, I got to spend a month in Colombia. My uncle married a native Colombian, and like he said something to me. We were in a taxi in this town called Santa Marta. It's like a little beach town where my aunt's family's from. And he looked at me. He goes, "You won the life lottery." And I've always thought about that quote. I'm like, what the fuck does that mean? But then looking at her family, my aunt's family, and seeing what they were living like in an apartment that only would, in our eyes, fit maybe 2 people max. They had 8 to 9 people in it, and they had air conditioning in only 1 bedroom. And in a beach town in Colombia, it's above 90 degrees on most days. So, like, the life lottery, it's a big fucking deal.
I'll go ahead and build off of that. Yeah. All of us here are white, straight men with Christian upbringings in middle or upper middle class America. We have it so well compared to the rest of the world that there really isn't anything much that we could do to improve ourselves. And
monetarily, but it's really the only way we can improve ourselves. Beyond that point, it's like, what do you want from us? That's my only argument.
So, Will, I feel like you were making a bunch of good points there, and I apologize for busting out laughing. All I could picture when you said that was my buddy Sam going, "I don't consider Jewish people white," which is a quote from a really funny college humor video about, like, which group of people is the best. It's a very inappropriate video, but it's hilarious, and I'm laughing because I come from
Jewish. Quote Family Guy, white.
Well, right. Now, it doesn't get more white than a 6'4" ginger over here, Chief.
But Justin, going back to what you and I were talking about, are there things that America can improve on? Yes. Is America perfect? No. But it's still my country, and I love it for that fact. And the reason that we're able to have, like, political discourse, whether or not it is civil, is such an important aspect for building the political intelligence of the civilian population. If you have a group of people where we just all agree on everything and just kind of be like, "Oh, yeah, sure, it sounds right, that's good to me," then there would be no growth whatsoever. We've all learned this discussing, like, post-episode, the first few episodes of this podcast, where we need to have some sort of discussion instead of just stating things that we all just agree on, because nothing grows out of it. It's not organic, and we just kind of just sit there, nod our heads, and say, "Yeah, it's cool," but whatever. So being able to talk about our differences and why I believe A and why you believe B is an important pillar of the American community. And that's not something that can happen anywhere or anywhen else. And that's part of the reason why I think being alive here and now, being who I am, is a true gift.
Yeah. I mean,
that's pretty solid. That's pretty solid right there. The only thing that I would have to say, and it's not even a disagreement, is just that, like, when I think about you saying, like, yeah, man, if you talk about the life lottery, if you're looking at a computer screen with 3 other white guys who, pretty much from a societal standpoint, got it easy, it's hard to have a lot to complain about without sounding really, really privileged.
Yeah, I mean, the only things that we have to complain about are meme worthy, first world problems. Oh, I'm getting 3G instead of 4G. What the hell? Like,
Mhm.
gas prices are 26 cents higher than they were last week. What gives? You know, like
Exactly.
the only real problems that we have are, just to give credence to the internet humor, are first world problems. You know, I've had to struggle. I have had to struggle, but I've not had to struggle as hard as many others out there. I've been very fortunate with the life that I've lived.
Definitely,
Big
definitely.
shout out to Ryan Higa, the original OG YouTuber.
Yes,
Go check
sir.
out his 2 videos on
Yeah.
first world problems because they are
Mhm,
comedic
mhm.
gold.
Mhm.
Here's a straw. Now suck it up. Here's a
Mhm.
full cup with a lid. Now shut the full cup.
I give my credit to mom and dad. Thanks, mom and dad.
There you go.
Yeah. Shout out to my
Also,
parents.
casually explained first world problems and levels of wealth. Iconic.
Definitely. Yeah.
What I wanted to say, and what I think might be a pretty powerful way to kind of steer the ending conversation of this is, there goes my wedding ring.
You better put that on right now.
That's a very powerful way to end the podcast. You are right.
Right.
Yeah.
Just like
I
that.
would edit that out just in case Natalie's watching.
She's always watching.
Yeah.
No,
Big brother.
what I really wanted to say, and what made itself evident as Justin and Will kind of played back their ideals and their idealism of America, is that I think there is truly, truly, truly something special about the Judeo-Christian worldview. And not to take a religious standpoint on things, and Justin's looking at me like I've lost my mind. I think there is genuinely something that sets it apart from any other portion of the world, and you can contrast it very clearly with the Pacific and Asia and China and Japan and India. This idea, regardless of your religion, regardless of your religious ideology, regardless of your expectations or thinking on the afterlife, fundamentally Western thinking is Judeo-Christian based. Our laws, our beliefs, our societal structure, the way that we group our families, the way that we take after our fathers. Judaism is passed down matrilineally. If your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. My mother is Jewish. I'm Jewish. I'm Messianic because I'm a Christian, but my kids won't be Jewish, but my sisters will. It's one of those things where, like, I don't get a choice in that, but almost everything is paternal, and that's based off of Judaism, the Bible. Our idea of what is morally correct comes from a Christian or at least religious perspective. You can argue whether it's Islamic, Christian, Judaist, whatever. Those core beliefs have funneled their way into the laws of the United States, the Constitution of the United States, the thinking and the mentality of the people writing those documents. Again, America was founded as a place that incentivized religious freedom. That's absolutely true. But the massive majority of the people writing the documents of the United States were believers. A massive majority of the United States population, when they broke away from Britain, were believers in faith. This is not extractable from the way that America has become. You look at the Bill of Rights, you look at the belief that people should be free, the belief that people should be able to pursue happiness. These are all religious based. Like, these are not things that you can necessarily just say this is human nature or this is that, because if you contrast it with China or the USSR or places where you were not given these freedoms, places where you were a tool in the cog of society, it's such a different understanding of what society looks like, of what your values look like. If you take a guy from Japan in 1941 and a guy from the United States and talk about what's important to you, what do you value? The guy in 1941 from America is going to talk about his family, his job, getting the girl. The guy in Japan is going to talk about how he needs to bring honor to his country. These are two things that are not the same. And it's from that background of government, of faith, of your family. But all of these things are still steered by this worldview. Again, I'm going on a very long monologue, but the point I want to make is this is unique to America. This idea that we need to help, that we need to give more, that we need to be present elsewhere. That is unique. You don't see China benevolently helping other countries. No other country's footing the bill for other countries that can't afford to pay for their defense. Like, why is America doing that if not out of the goodwill of its heart? But where does goodwill come from? Again, I could literally go on for a long time. There's a lot there, and you can call me out on any of it.
Okay.
Nation states are not charitable because they're only concerned with one thing, that is their own survival.
Will, I don't want to cut you off. Am I able to take this one away?
Yes.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack. The first thing in my mind before I get into it is, why would we fund another country's defense? I'm going to say it is not because we feel like giving, especially in the case of Israel. Obviously, on the surface, you could say Judeo-Christian values in alignment. I think it is because, in this specific case, Israel is the only Western power in the Middle East, and they have long been our closest ally, so that's more of a geopolitical thing. If we're going to unpack the whole thing, might be a little spicy, but I definitely think I'm on the opposite side. I think Western thinking is probably founded and based off of a lot of Judeo-Christian values. I don't necessarily think that has always been the case and or the best thing for the people living in any part of the world. If we're going to look at like older, before America's even founded, if we're looking at like Christianity, Catholicism, certainly was not good for the people in the East. There is no other religion that has
crusade coming
yeah. There's no other religion that has waged not just one but multiple crusades. I mean, you could argue that Islam expanded under Dar al-Islam, but I mean, that's could arguably be viewed as just like expansion of an empire, obviously with religious backings.
There
but
were definitely some Islamic crusades.
Yeah, exactly. Historically speaking, Muslims have been the most tolerant religion out of any religion in general. I mean, if you were living in the Ottoman Empire or some kind of pre-Islamic empire, you just had to pay what they would call a book tax. You were all children of the book, and if you were a Christian or a Jew, you simply just paid a tax. And if you're a Muslim, this tax did not apply to you. If you were a Muslim and I was a Christian, like, I'm coming to Jerusalem and like we're gonna talk about it. There's no paying taxes. Okay, so in the olden times, I don't necessarily think that it was the best. In the founding of America, in that sense, the founding fathers were not Christian. None of them. I mean, they all could be considered deists, theists, whatever you want to say. I mean, they all believed in something. A lot of them questioned many of the Christian values, and a lot of it was rooted in scientific evidence mixed with some sort of religious belief. So, I don't think that America was necessarily founded on Christian values, and I think in today's day and age, that's where we run into a lot of problems. Is politicians on Capitol Hill want to talk about, like, we need to get back to basics, like, we need to reintroduce faith into the country, and like, no. That's honestly causing more problems than it was when we were without that. I mean, under God was only added to the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s to combat the Red Scare, because we viewed communists as godless, filthy, anarchists.
This is McCarthyism.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, under God was not even part of our Pledge of Allegiance. And
well, we also do the Pledge of Allegiance like that before Hitler made it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Right.
So
Justin, the hand salute and a mustache.
Yeah. Not the mustache.
Right.
I don't want to cut you off because you're making some really good points, and I don't necessarily disagree with what a lot of you said. Like, I think the Crusades were a horrible blight against humanity. Like, regardless of faith orientation, I don't believe that the Crusades were the embodiment of Christ on earth. Like, I think that was the mechanization of European powers utilizing religion as a societal tool to achieve an objective they wanted. Like, there was many things behind the Crusades, and very little of it was Christ. Now, again, like, I'm not necessarily saying that George Washington and all the other founding fathers were sitting at home reading their Bibles. The primary point was all of them came from a Protestant or Catholic faith background. Whether they themselves were true believers or not, that was their framework of growing up. That was their framework of, hey, this is what my family did. This is what my parents believe. This is what my society practices. Again, regardless of religious orientation, society upholds a framework of relatively Judeo-Christian values in the West. Now, again, I'm not necessarily saying that I think church should be in schools, or that we need to get God back in our, like whatever. Like, I very much so agree with the separation of church and state in America. I think that is something that is very important, and that is a core piece of legislation that helps keep America moving forward. Again, when faith becomes mechanized to push a social or political agenda, you run into some serious problems. But I don't believe that America would be the same if those values were not intrinsic in its community.
I want to pose the question to Will and Jarod. I want to hear everything they have to say. In response to Ben, and to kick off your response, Will and Jarod, is it not acceptable to just say that those are American values? And by that, I just mean, like, do they have to be Judeo-Christian, or can a lot of these be defined as American values, and that's why you should value these things, because that's what our country was founded upon?
Well, our country was settled by people that most closely resemble Christians. Like you said, our founding fathers were mostly deists as opposed to Catholics or Protestants. But we could very easily tie this into the great experiment of what the United States of America is supposed to be. Is, can we perpetuate a democracy of all these different people who believe in all these different things without fundamentally altering the core tenets of our Constitution and what we believe in? Can we have Muslims and Jews and Christians coexisting and voting together and not have it resort to mass political violence? As we've said, if anybody has been paying half of attention to the news, they've noticed that hate crimes are on the rise. Now, whether or not that's because people hate Muslims and Christians and Jews more than they did before, or is it just because we've given hate crimes a definition on its own, and we've now categorized murders and all that into a different category? I don't know. I haven't done that much research on it. But to say whether or not it's an American value, I think religion does play a core role in what it means to be an American, whether or not you choose to have a religion or choose not to be. What?
No, I was just like, yeah.
One, because it's you yourself, Will, agreeing with him, and two, because you agreed with him.
Facts.
So just to round out, it is an American philosophy, but it also ties into people who choose not to believe. Atheists, they should also, atheists, agnostics, or people who just plain old don't care. They should also be thrown. They should also be thrown They should also be thrown into the circle with the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians and the Buddhists and the Taoists and the animists, or the Zoroastrians, if they even exist anymore.
Is that even a word? Jesus Christ.
Yes, it is.
Are those the people that are fish people and legends?
No,
This guy loves ancient Persia, doesn't even know what a Zoroastrian is. He's a
it's like an extremely watered down and semi-offensive definition of Zoroastrians.
They're the dolphin people. They're the dolphin people. That's fine. I'll take
it's
it.
the OG Christianity.
Okay. The OG.
Does that answer your question, Justin?
Yeah, I mean that definitely answers my question. I think that touches on everything Ben said. I mean, Jarod, man, you're our guest here. Please enlighten us with your guest opinion. What do you think?
No, like we'll touch on a lot of the stuff. I mean, like what Ben and you were talking about as far as like the Christianity and Judaism type situation where we both follow in our father's footsteps. I agree because I didn't have a dad. Spoiler alert, but like but
press F to pay respects.
The person who was most likely, like who was most father-like to me, I am doing exactly what he did. But to kind of end off on the note, Kanye 2024, let's go.
No.
Are you able to edit his entire part out?
Honestly, we might just cut the episode. No, I mean, one of the things that became more and more evident to me as we had this conversation was, I think, the beauty of America, regardless of religious orientation, framework, whatever. We can have this conversation. We can have the debate of the impact of fatherhood after, as I'm reading the comments here. Quit talking about Kanye in the comments.
What do you say?
You know, like we can have the debate because we have the ability to think about it. You know, we can consider the implications. We can consider, you know, retroactively. I don't believe that the founding fathers were sitting around a table thinking about what value system they wanted to craft the political and the government organization around. But I think it was a reality of their surroundings and what they were a part of. You know, deism was, you know, rampant at that time, but it was shortly on the heels of like the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Like that was the hot button of the time, was to like think about your faith, think about your beliefs. Why do you think about this? Can you support this? You know, that was what was going on. And I think now we've come to a super cool spot as a society where we can begin to examine what components combined to create the experiment that is America. Like it's still ongoing. We don't know where it's going to go. You know, if any, I'm just going to mute the chat real quick. It's one of these things that, like, you know, being able to sit here and have this conversation is a blessing that other people in other countries do not have.
I concur.
And being able to make, you know, fun of celebrities and, you know, spicy comments and like, you know, that is a luxury that we have. And I don't want to belittle that. You know, like we have a cool platform as peers and as friends here hosting this podcast. We clearly have different ideas, different understandings of America, but we're all still here as friends at the end of disagreeing on multiple like core issues and core components of, you know, personality. I'm gonna like, can I end this? Like, you know, to end out on a horrible and on that terrible disappointment. It's time to end. You know, like I don't understand how we got here when we started talking about China and Evergrand, but I think that's where the beauty of America is, that China couldn't do something like this.
No,
like, I don't see, you know, 3 or 4 dudes in China having a conversation about the difference between China and America on a political and religious spectrum. I just don't even think that's on the radar.
the government
And I think
will tell you
that's-
for that in China.
Definitely. They have your phones.
And-
Look at Huawei. They have your phones. And so, like, I mean,
Oh, Huawei and a whole other sphere of internet is something that we could have a whole video on. But I think we're at the point now where we can make closing statements.
Mm-hmm.
Ben,
Closing statements.
Ben, you had a good closing statement, so you can consider that criteria satisfied if you'd like. But I would like to echo what Ben said. Us being here talking about this stuff where we can criticize and opine and discuss topics of interest like this is a privilege that really nobody ever in history has been able to enjoy until now. And if you live in the United States and in some parts of Europe, yes, you do have that privilege. I mean, we're sitting here, you know, in our own apartments, or you guys in your workspace with $1,000 laptops, and we're just talking shit about the stuff that stimulates us. And that's something that I really try not to take for granted, because you know, we all enjoy history and we know to a certain extent what people have lived like. And 20 years ago in the 90s, when the internet was just becoming a thing, I mean, it was a whole different world, and the world was different. The United States was different. And you know, what year is it? 2021. It's
Not for long.
really something that it's really something that is unique, and it's quite possible that our ability to enjoy doing something like this is temporary. So that's why we have to not exploit it, but take advantage of the fact that we have this opportunity before it's gone.
Yeah.
Justin?
I don't even know if we need to have Justin say anything. I think that
I don't have a whole lot to say. I think just to build off of what Will said, it's important that we, rather than enjoy this opportunity while it's here, I think it's important that we safeguard it and ensure that it's not an opportunity, it's a right, and an established one at that. I think it's important that we fight for these and make sure that people, regardless of what your opinion is, are able to speak out, you know, host your own podcast, do whatever, rather than saying it's, you know, speak your mind while you can. I think you should always be able to, and we should always be vigilant and mindful of things in our society that occur, regardless of who they're perpetrated by or what your personal politics may be. I think it's important to call those when you see them.
Yeah, 100%.
Jarod, afterwards?
I was gonna play the Fourth Dimension song with Kanye and Kid Cudi as my exit, but I think we've already done that in the chat.
I'll
so-
mute you right now. Like,
All right.
one thing.
Next episode.
There you go.
With that,
Mute me.
one thing that made me kind of come to like just thought about this, and I'm gonna end with this horrible joke. So in America, you can say we could capitalize on the opportunity that we have before us, but in China, they communize on the opportunity provided to them.